Have you ever poured your entire soul into someone, only to have them toss it aside like yesterday's newspaper? Have you ever looked at your own child and seen a stranger staring back, their eyes reflecting the cold, hard glitter of greed? I have. And I learned that sometimes the only way to find out what's truly in a person's heart is to strip away everything they value on the surface. My name is Margaret Lewis, and this is the story of how I orchestrated my own downfall to expose the rotten core of my family. It's a story of love, loss, and the bone-deep satisfaction of justice served cold. Where are you watching from right now? A comfortable home your parents provided? A quiet apartment you worked hard to secure? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And while you're there, do an old woman a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you know. Now, settle in, because this is the story of how I lost a son but saved myself. The California sun used to feel different. For 30 years, it had spilled into the 5 bedrooms of our coastal villa, warming the Italian marble floors and glinting off the crystal vases. My late husband, Richard, loved to fill with lilies. It was a benevolent sun, a partner in the beautiful life we had built. Now, it just felt harsh, like an interrogator's lamp exposing every crack and flaw. Richard had been gone for a year, and the grief was a physical weight, a constant pressure behind my ribs. But a new, sharper pain had begun to eclipse it, the chilling distance of my son, Ethan, and his wife, Vanessa. They visited less and less, their calls becoming brief, transactional affairs. They'd ask about the estate, the stock portfolio, the management of assets. They never asked about the hollowness in my heart. The idea came to me on a Tuesday, the day our gardener of 2 decades, Miguel, came to tell me he was retiring. He spoke of his grandchildren, his small home in Oxnard, the joy he found in his family. There was a richness in his voice that I hadn't heard in my own sons for years. That night, I sat in Richard's leather armchair, a glass of untouched Chardonnay sweating on the mahogany side table, and the plan began to form. It was a terrible, desperate seed of an idea. What if it was all gone? The money, the house, the comfort they'd known their entire lives. Would they step up? Would the son I raised, the boy who once made me dandelion bouquets, reappear from behind the facade of the man who only saw me as a living trust? The next morning, I called my lawyer, Mr. Albright, a man whose quiet integrity Richard had trusted implicitly. I laid it all out. We would create a fiction, a convincing narrative of a catastrophic investment loss, a Ponzi scheme, something plausible and devastating. My liquid assets would be seized, my accounts frozen. All my tangible wealth, the house, the art, the jewelry, the cars, everything would be legally transferred into a blind trust, shielded from everyone, including Ethan, to the world, and to my son. Margaret Lewis would be destitute. Margaret, are you certain? Albright's voice was graveled with concern over the phone. The emotional toll of such a deception, the emotional toll of the truth is already killing me. James, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I have to know. The pieces fell into place with chilling efficiency. Albright was a master of his craft. Within a week, the legal framework was in place. The final step was the most difficult, the phone call. I rehearsed it a dozen times, but when I dialed Ethan's number, my hand trembled. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice distracted. "Hey, Mom, I'm just heading into a meeting, and what's up?" I took a breath and shattered my own world. "Ethan, something's happened. Something terrible." I let my voice crack, a feat that required little acting. I told him about the investment, The charismatic con man, the life savings built with his father, all gone. I told him I was losing the house. Silence hung on the line, thick and heavy. It wasn't the silence of shock or sympathy. It was the silence of calculation. "Oh my God, Mom," he finally said, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. Are you sure? All of it?" "Everything. Ethan, the bank is taking the house. I have to be out by the end of the month." More silence. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the mental abacus clicking away. Then, Vanessa's sharp voice in the background, a muffled, "What is it?" He must have covered the receiver, but I heard him whisper, "My mom. She lost everything." When he came back on the line, his tone had shifted. It was brisk, professional. "Okay, Mom, don't panic. Vanessa and I will figure something out. We'll handle it. Just stay put for now. We'll come down this weekend. We'll handle it." Not, "We'll be there for you," or "Are you okay?" It was the language one used for a problem, an inconvenience to be managed. As I hung up the phone, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the grand living room into shadow. For the first time, I felt a sliver of cold, hard certainty pierce through the fog of my grief. I was doing the right thing. I had to see the truth, no matter how ugly, and I had a sickening feeling that the ugliest part was yet to come. I walked over to the grand fireplace and picked up a silver-framed photo of a smiling 10-year-old Ethan on a fishing trip with his father. He was holding up a small bass, his face beaming with pride. Where did that boy go? I was about to find out. The home I found was the perfect antithesis to my life. It was a small, 2-bedroom rental on the forgotten side of town, nestled between a laundromat and a convenience store that seemed to sell more liquor than milk. The air, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and stale grease, was a world away from the clean, salty breeze I was used to. The paint on the walls was a sickly yellow, peeling in corners, and the linoleum floor was scuffed with the ghosts of tenants past. It was perfect. It was a place no one would ever suspect was part of a wealthy woman's elaborate test. Ethan and Vanessa arrived that weekend, their silver Mercedes looking alien and offensive, parked on the cracked asphalt curb. Vanessa didn't even try to hide her disgust. She stepped out of the car as if afraid the ground might soil her $1,000 shoes, her nose wrinkled at the unfamiliar smells. She hugged me with 2 stiff pats on the back, her eyes darting around the cramped living room, cataloging every flaw. "My God, Mom," she said, her voice a carefully modulated whisper of pity. "It's cozy." In her vocabulary, cozy was a synonym for squalid. Ethan was more practiced, but his discomfort was just as palpable. He went through the motions, asking if I needed anything, but his gaze kept drifting away, out the grime-streaked window, as if searching for an escape. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the problem I had become. "We've been talking," he began, settling awkwardly on the edge of a lumpy floral sofa. Vanessa stood beside him, her arms crossed, a silent, judgmental partner. "Obviously, you can't stay here long term. It's not safe or sanitary. I don't have a choice." "Ethan," I said, my voice deliberately frail, "this is all I can afford." "Right. Well," he cleared his throat, "we've been thinking about the assets, the tangible things. The house is gone, but there's still the art, the jewelry, your car." "Your father's collection," I murmured, a genuine pang of loss hitting me. Each painting, each sculpture, held a memory. Vanessa stepped forward, her practiced sympathy as thin as onion skin. "Margaret, we know this is hard, but those things represent capital. And right now, you need capital. We can sell them, quickly and quietly, to help pay off some of the residual debts and get you into a more suitable arrangement. They had it all figured out. They had a list, an appraiser. They spoke of my life's treasures, the things Richard and I had lovingly collected over decades in terms of liquidation value. They saw a Patek Philippe watch not as the gift I gave my husband on our 25th anniversary, but as a quick $10,000. They saw my diamond necklace not as the piece he clasped around my neck the night Ethan was born, but as an asset to be leveraged. "We'll handle the logistics," Ethan assured me, patting my hand with the detached air of a doctor delivering bad news. "You don't need to worry about a thing. We'll hire a reputable estate sales company." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They weren't offering me a room in their spacious home. They weren't offering to supplement my income. They were offering to sell my past to fund my bleak, minimal future, all while keeping their own manicured hands clean. That evening, after they left for their 5-star hotel, we couldn't possibly impose, "Mom, you need your space." I sat alone in the dim, unfamiliar apartment. The only thing I had brought with me from the villa, aside from a few suitcases of clothes, was Richard's old leather-bound journal. I ran my hand over the worn cover. He had been a keen observer of people, and he had been worried about Ethan long before I was. "You give him everything, my love," he'd once written. "But you can't give him a backbone. That he has to grow himself." It seemed Richard was right. I was seeing it now with my own eyes. My son's backbone wasn't just missing, it had been replaced by a price tag, one carefully applied by his calculating wife. They weren't just selling my belongings. They were selling our history. They were liquidating our memories. And as I sat there, the righteous anger that had been a flicker began to glow, a hot, steady coal in the pit of my stomach. They thought I was a victim, a charity case. They had no idea I was the one holding the match, waiting for the right moment to set their gilded world on fire. The call started a week later. It was Vanessa, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet efficiency. She'd found an excellent estate liquidator. They were very discreet and specialized in high-value collections. She sent me the paperwork to sign via a courier, a thick manila envelope that felt like a death certificate for my past life. I signed it with a hand that didn't shake, my signature clear and firm. Every stroke of the pen was a promise to myself, a promise of retribution. The first item to go was my car, a vintage Mercedes convertible that Richard and I had taken on countless drives up the Pacific Coast Highway, the wind in our hair. Vanessa informed me it sold for a very reasonable price. A few days later, she texted me a photo, not of the car, but of a new, ridiculously expensive espresso machine in her kitchen. The caption read, "A little pick-me-up. You know how Ethan is without his morning latte." The callousness was a physical blow. They weren't even trying to hide it. My memories were funding their lattes. But the true turning point, the moment my sorrow curdled into a cold, diamond-hard resolve, came when they sold the piano. It was a Steinway Grand, a magnificent instrument that had been the heart of our home. Richard had bought it for me for our 10th anniversary. He didn't play, but he loved to listen. Countless evenings were spent with me at the keys, playing Chopin and Debussy while he sat in his armchair, a contented smile on his face. It was more than a piano. It was the soundtrack of our marriage. I found out from Maria, my former housekeeper, who still called to check on me, her voice full of genuine concern. "Mrs. Lewis," she said, her tone hesitant. "I drove past the house today. There were men. They were taking the piano out. It was heartbreaking." That night, sleep was impossible. I lay on the lumpy mattress in my sad little apartment, the sounds of the city a poor substitute for the familiar rhythm of the ocean. All I could hear was the phantom music of that piano. I saw Richard's smiling face. I saw Ethan as a little boy, plunking out, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," with his tiny fingers. I saw all the Christmases, the birthdays, the quiet moments of beauty that instrument had witnessed. And now it was gone, sold to the highest bidder to finance God knows what new bauble for Vanessa. A wave of grief, so powerful it felt like drowning, washed over me. I had cried for Richard. I had cried for the life we'd lost. But this was different. This was a funeral for the love I thought my son had for me. He was erasing me. He and his wife were systematically dismantling the evidence of my existence, of his own history, and they were doing it with a cheerful, detached efficiency that was nothing short of monstrous. I got out of bed, the floor cold beneath my feet, and walked to the small desk in the corner. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. The tears stopped. The shaking in my hands ceased. A profound, chilling clarity settled over me. Grief was a passive state. It was something that happened to you. But anger was an action. It was a force. It demanded a response. Under the dim light of a cheap desk lamp, I began to write. I made a list, not of what they had sold, but of what they had stolen. My trust, my memories, my son. And beneath that, I started another list, this one titled The Plan. My initial idea had been simply to test them, to see the truth. Now, it was no longer enough to see the truth. I needed them to feel it. I needed them to understand the consequences of their choices, to experience a fraction of the cold, dismissive cruelty they had shown me. My deception would no longer be a simple shield. It would become a weapon, and I would wield it with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. The sorrow hadn't vanished, but it had found a new and terrible purpose. It was no longer a weight holding me down. It was the fuel for the fire I was about to build. And I would make sure Ethan and Vanessa were standing right in the center when it finally roared to life. My new life became a study in contrasts. By day, I was the picture of a fallen woman. I took the bus, shopped at discount grocery stores, and learned to make a single chicken last for 3 meals. I made acquaintances with my neighbors, a single mother working 2 jobs, an elderly man on a fixed income. I listened to their stories of real hardship, and it only sharpened the disgust I felt for my son's manufactured world of luxury and entitlement. Their daily struggles were real. My son's perceived hardship was that he had to arrange for the sale of his mother's priceless antiques. By night, my cramped apartment transformed into a war room. The legal pad had been replaced by spreadsheets and timelines. Mr. Albright and I spoke daily. He had engaged a private investigator, a discreet man named Peterson, who began to build a detailed portfolio of Ethan and Vanessa's life. It was a sickening and validating experience. Peterson's reports arrived in plain brown envelopes, and each one was a fresh twist of the knife. They weren't just selling my assets to get me into a suitable home. They were funding a lifestyle upgrade. There was the lease on a new Porsche for Ethan, a series of receipts from a designer boutique on Rodeo Drive for Vanessa, totaling more than my entire, fictional, annual living expenses. There were folio numbers for new stock purchases, made with the proceeds from my father's art collection. They were using my legacy to build their own, a new empire built on the rubble of their mothers. They're not even covering their tracks. Margaret, Albright said during one of our calls, a note of disbelief in his voice. It's as if they believe you've simply vanished from the earth, that there will be no accounting. That's because, in their minds, I have, I replied, the words tasting like ash. The Margaret Lewis they knew, the one who held the purse strings, is gone. They're dealing with a ghost. James. And ghosts don't ask for receipts. The most damning evidence came from social media. Vanessa, in her infinite arrogance, was a prolific poster. Her Instagram was a curated monument to her own vanity and my son's spinelessness. There she was, laughing with friends on my yacht, the Sea Spirit, which I'd been told was sold for parts to cover a tax liability. She posted a photo of her wrist, adorned with my mother's diamond tennis bracelet, a piece I had explicitly told Ethan was to be passed down to his own daughter, should he ever have one. The caption read, "Vintage find or old money vibes." I saved every post, every photo, every smug caption. Each one was another brick in the wall of their prison. I learned to navigate the digital world, becoming a silent observer of their glittering, hollow lives. I watched them attend charity galas, donating trivial sums of my money for a photo op, their smiles broad and empty. They were lauded in local society pages as a philanthropic young couple, dutifully managing the complicated estate of the reclusive, recently impoverished Margaret Lewis. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost artistic. One evening, a report from Peterson contained a detail that made my blood run cold. They were planning a party. Not just any party, but a lavish 10th anniversary celebration. The venue, my villa, my home. They had evidently leased it back from the bank for the event, a grand gesture to show their friends that, despite the family tragedy, they were still on top. The invitations had already gone out. I stared at the digitally copied invitation on my computer screen. Ethan and Vanessa Lewis. It read, "Request the pleasure of your company." At the home they were systematically stripping bare. The home where his father had died. The home where I had raised him. They were going to dance on our graves. A slow smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled in months, and it was not a pleasant one. It was a predator's smile. They had just handed me the perfect stage for my final act. Their arrogance, their bottomless greed, would not just be their undoing, it would be their public humiliation. I picked up the phone to call Albright. "James," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I need you to prepare the final documents, and please, clear your calendar for the evening of October 25th. We've been invited to a party." The weeks leading up to the anniversary party were a special kind of torture. Vanessa's social media became a fire hose of opulent preparations. There were pictures of flower arrangements that cost more than my monthly rent, photos of a celebrity chef they'd hired to cater the event, a video of a string quartet rehearsing in what used to be my living room. Each post was a new desecration, a fresh layer of glitter paint on my family's coffin. She wrote about making new memories in this special place, as if my own memories had been power washed away along with the grime from the patio stones. Ethan was a ghost in her posts, a handsome accessory who appeared in photos with his arm around her, his smile as bright and fake as the cubic zirconia on a cheap ring. I searched his eyes in every picture, looking for a flicker of doubt, of guilt, of the son I once knew. I found nothing. He was a willing participant, a co-conspirator in the erasure of his own mother. He was happy. He was thriving. The thought was a constant dull ache. My own preparations were far more subdued. From my shadowed life, I watched. I listened. Maria, my former housekeeper, would call with updates. She still had friends on the staff that Ethan and Vanessa had temporarily hired for their party. She told me how they spoke of me in the past tense as poor Margaret. How Vanessa would complain that the Sub-Zero refrigerator wasn't holding temperature properly, the same refrigerator Richard and I had installed 2 years prior. They were living in my life, using my things, and complaining about the quality. The rage I felt was a clean, purifying fire. It burned away the last vestiges of my hope for Ethan's redemption. He wasn't lost. He had chosen his path. He had traded his mother for a life of catered parties and designer clothes. He had looked at 30 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion and decided it was worth less than a new Porsche. The day of the party, a strange calm settled over me. There was nothing left to do but wait. Peterson, the PI, sent me one last text message. They're expecting 150 guests. Security is at the gate, but they have a guest list. Your name is not on it. It doesn't need to be, I texted back. As dusk fell over the city, I put on my chosen outfit. It wasn't a gown or a designer dress. It was a simple, well-worn pair of gray slacks, a modest blouse, and a cardigan I'd bought at a second-hand store. My hair was tied back simply, with no jewelry except for my plain gold wedding band, the one thing I had refused to let them liquidate. I looked in the cracked mirror of my apartment bathroom. I looked tired. I looked older. I looked like a woman who had lost everything. I was in costume. Mr. Albright arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, his expression grim but resolute. He carried a handsome leather briefcase. It didn't contain champagne or a festive gift. It contained proof. It contained deeds, trust documents, bank statements, and printouts of every smug social media post Vanessa had ever made. It contained their ruin. "Are you ready, Margaret?" he asked, his voice soft. I took one last look around the shabby apartment that had been my sanctuary and my command center. I had learned more about myself and my family in these peeling, water-stained walls than I had in 30 years of luxury. "I'm ready," I said, my voice devoid of any tremor. "Let's not be late for my son's party." We drove in Albright's quiet, dignified sedan. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. As we ascended the winding road towards the villa, the familiar scent of night-blooming jasmine filled the air. Below us, the lights of the town twinkled, a sea of distant stars. And then we saw it, my home, blazing with light, music spilling from its open doors like a river of sound. It looked like a cruise ship had run aground on the hillside. Cars, expensive and gleaming, lined the long driveway. Laughter and the clinking of glasses drifted on the breeze. They were dancing on the grave of my old life, utterly convinced they had gotten away with it. I felt a profound sense of peace. The storm was finally here. We parked a short distance down the road, hidden by the shadows of the tall cypress trees that lined the property. From our vantage point, we could see the figures moving on the terrace, silhouettes of wealth and carelessness against the warm glow of the house. Albright turned to me. "There's a service entrance around the back, near the gardens. Miguel's son works for the catering company. He's expecting us. He'll let us in." Miguel. The gardener whose simple devotion to his family had sparked this entire charade. It was fitting that his family would now help me bring it to a close. As we made our way through the manicured hedges, the scent of roses, my roses, was thick in the air. I could hear Vanessa's shrill laugh cut through the murmur of the crowd. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard to my soul. Miguel's son, a polite young man named Carlos, met us by the kitchen door. His eyes were full of a sad respect. "Mrs. Lewis," he whispered, holding the door open. "It's good to see you. What they've done, it's not right." "Thank you, Carlos," I murmured, patting his arm. "Your father is a good man." The kitchen was a chaotic hive of activity. Chefs in white coats barked orders. Servers rushed in and out with trays of champagne and elaborate canapes. No one paid us any mind. We were invisible. An old woman in shabby clothes and a man in a simple suit. We were the help. We slipped through the chaos and found ourselves in the main hallway, just out of sight of the main party in the grand salon. From my hiding spot behind a large potted ficus, I had a clear view, and what I saw made the blood pound in my ears. There, standing near the fireplace, was Mrs. Bogable, a dear friend of my late husband and me for over 40 years. She was a sweet, unassuming woman, the widow of Richard's first business partner. Her face was etched with confusion and hurt. She was trying to speak to Ethan, but he kept glancing over her shoulder, clearly impatient. Vanessa stood beside him, a plastic smile plastered on her face. "Ethan, I just don't understand," Mrs. Gable was saying, her voice trembling slightly. "Margaret would never have sold this painting. It was Richard's favorite. A Pissarro." He said it reminded him of their honeymoon in France. Ethan shifted his weight, his discomfort obvious. "Eleanor, it's complicated. Mom, she made some bad decisions. We're doing our best to manage the fallout." "But to not even tell me?" she pressed on, her voice cracking. "She's not answering my calls. I've been so worried. Is she all right?" Vanessa stepped in, her voice as smooth and cold as marble. "Eleanor, I think you've had a little too much champagne," she said, her smile never faltering as she subtly took her arm to steer her away. "Margaret is fine. She's adjusting. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have guests to greet." She guided the bewildered old woman towards the door, her grip firm, her message clear. "You are no longer welcome here. You are a relic of a past we are trying to erase." I watched as Mrs. Gable, a woman who had bounced Ethan on her knee, a woman who had held my hand at Richard's funeral, was politely but firmly shown the door. She was a loose end, a connection to the truth, and they had snipped it. Just like that. That was the final confirmation. If I had possessed even a single, lingering shred of doubt about the necessity of my actions, it vanished in that moment. This wasn't just about money or greed anymore. It was about a fundamental lack of humanity. They were so consumed with building their new, glittering life that they were willing to discard anyone and anything that didn't fit into their narrative. They weren't just erasing me. They were erasing our entire shared history, our friends, our loyalties. They were salting the earth of their own past. I felt Albright's hand on my shoulder, a steadying pressure. "It's time," he said softly. I nodded, my jaw set. I looked at my son across the room. He was laughing now, accepting a flute of champagne from a server. He looked at Vanessa and raised his glass in a toast, his eyes full of adoration for the woman who had so expertly hollowed out his soul. He looked happy, carefree, and utterly damned. I took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the tree. The grand salon was packed. Bodies draped in silk and dripping with jewels were clustered together, their laughter and chatter creating a meaningless symphony of self-congratulation. I moved through them like a ghost, my simple cardigan and worn slacks a stark contrast to their calculated glamour. A few people glanced at me, a flicker of confusion in their eyes, a maid, perhaps, or a kitchen worker who had lost her way. They dismissed me just as quickly. I was invisible to them, a creature from a world they had paid good money to avoid. I saw Ethan and Vanessa in the center of the room, holding court. Vanessa was telling a story, her hands gesturing wildly, the stolen diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the light and scattering it like fractured stars. Ethan was beaming, his arm possessively around her waist. They were the king and queen of this stolen castle. I made my way to the small dais where the string quartet was playing a saccharine version of a pop song. During a brief pause between numbers, I stepped up onto the platform. I picked up the microphone that was set up for the evening speeches. The feedback shrieked for a moment, a piercing sound that cut through the din of the party. The chatter faltered. Heads turned. 100 conversations died at once, and then they saw me. The silence that fell was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than any noise. Every eye in the room was on me, a mixture of shock, confusion, and pity on their faces. I scanned the crowd until my gaze locked with Ethan's. The color drained from his face. He looked as if he had seen an actual ghost. Vanessa's smile froze, then twisted into a mask of disbelief and fury. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice amplified, steady, and clear. It held none of the frailty they expected. It held the authority of a woman who owned the very floorboards on which they stood. "I know I'm not on the guest list, but then I've never needed an invitation to my own home." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. I saw Vanessa whisper something urgently to Ethan, but he was frozen, his eyes wide, fixed on me. "For those of you who don't know me," I continued, letting my eyes drift over the sea of unfamiliar faces. "My name is Margaret Lewis. This was my home. This was the home I built with my late husband, Richard. The home where I raised my son, Ethan." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I saw Ethan take a half step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. "I know what you've all been told," I said, my voice softening with a convincing imitation of sorrow, "that I fell on hard times, that I made foolish investments and lost everything, that my loving son and his caring wife have been managing what little is left." I saw people exchange uneasy glances. I saw the dawning horror on the faces of the few guests who had actually known me and Richard for years. "It's a very sad story," I said, a humorless smile touching my lips. "And I'm here tonight to tell you that every single word of it is a lie." I turned my head slightly and nodded towards the grand archway leading to the hall. On cue, Mr. Albright stepped into the room, his leather briefcase in hand. He walked with a quiet, deliberate pace to the dais and stood beside me. The sight of him, a respected and well-known attorney, sent a new wave of shock through the assembly. This was no longer just a crazy old woman crashing a party. This was something else entirely. "My son and his wife," I said, my voice rising, imbued with a cold fury that made the microphone tremble slightly in my hand, "believed I was destitute. And in that belief, they showed their true character. They sold my art, my furniture, my memories, all to fund the lavish lifestyle you see around you tonight." I pointed a trembling finger towards Vanessa's wrist. "That bracelet? A family heirloom. The champagne you're drinking? Paid for with the sale of my husband's watch collection. This very party is a monument to their greed, built on a foundation of lies." Vanessa finally found her voice. "She's delirious," she shrieked, her carefully constructed composure shattering. "She's lost her mind. Security, get her out of here." "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing. "And neither is the security. As of an hour ago, they work for me again." I looked at Albright. "James, if you would." This was it, the moment of reckoning, the invitation they never knew they'd sent. Mr. Albright opened his briefcase with a pair of decisive snaps that echoed in the cavernous silence. He produced a thick, bound document from within. The cover was simple, with a single label, "The Lewis Trust, Final Disposition." He held it up for all to see. "As Mrs. Lewis has stated," Albright began, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the tension, "the narrative of her financial ruin was a fabrication, a test, if you will. For the past year, all of Mrs. Lewis's assets, this house, the art, the stock portfolio, everything have been held in an irrevocable blind trust, of which I am the sole executor. He let that sink in. I watched as the implications dawned on Ethan and Vanessa. Their faces, already pale, turned a ghostly white. The blood had left them entirely. The trust documents were structured with a specific morality clause. Albright continued, flipping to a tabbed page. It stipulated that if the primary heir, Ethan Lewis, and his spouse, Vanessa Lewis, failed to provide adequate emotional and financial support to his mother in her time of need, control of the assets would revert entirely and immediately to a predetermined secondary beneficiary. Vanessa let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. No, that's not possible. We had power of attorney. The power of attorney you had me sign was for the liquidation of residual personal effects to cover debts. I said, stepping forward again, my voice dripping with ice. Debts that never existed. And you liquidated them, didn't you? You sold everything you could get your hands on. You sold your father's Pissarro. You sold my mother's pearls. You sold my piano. And James and I have the receipts for every single transaction. And we also have the receipts for the Porsche, the shopping sprees, and the new stock portfolio you built with the proceeds. Albright placed a second, even thicker, binder on the lectern. This contains a full accounting of the assets sold and the subsequent purchases made by Mr. and Mrs. Misau Lewis. It also contains sworn affidavits from auction houses, jewelers, and a full social media record cataloging their expenditures. A woman in the front row gasped and covered her mouth. The party guests were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses at an execution. They began to back away from Ethan and Vanessa, creating a circle of shame around the couple. You tricked us, Ethan finally stammered, his voice a pathetic whimper. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, but there was no love in them, only the terror of a cornered animal. How could you do this to me? I'm your son. My son? I laughed, a raw, humorless sound that echoed in the silent room. My son would have opened his home to me. My son would have given me a place at his table, not sold the table for a profit. My son would have helped me, not calculated how much my memories were worth on the open market. I don't know who you are, but you are not the son I raised. I turned my attention to Vanessa, who was now openly weeping, her mascara running in black rivulets down her cheeks. And you, I said, my voice low and venomous, you were the architect of this. You saw a lonely old woman and a pile of money, and you thought you could just sweep me aside. You thought you were so clever, but you underestimated me. You thought my heart was as small and as empty as your own. I let the silence hang for a moment longer before delivering the final blow. So, to be clear to everyone here tonight, I announced, my voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. I was never bankrupt. I am, in fact, wealthier than I have ever been. This house is mine. The car you drive is mine. The money in your bank account, the very clothes on your back, they were all bought with my money. And now, I want it all back. I nodded to the uniformed security guards who had materialized at the exits. Ethan, Vanessa, you have 5 minutes to leave my property. Take your coats, your purses, and nothing else. If you are not gone by the time I count to 300, I will have you arrested for trespassing. The Grand Salon, moments before a stage for their triumph, became their public pillory. The silence was broken only by Vanessa's ragged sobs as the security guards moved toward them. Ethan stood paralyzed, his face a mask of utter devastation. He looked around at the faces of his friends, the people whose respect he had so desperately courted. He found no sympathy. Their expressions ranged from shock to morbid curiosity to thinly veiled contempt. They were already distancing themselves, mentally composing the gossip they would share for weeks to come. "Mom, please," Ethan begged, taking a step toward me. "Don't do this. We can talk about this." "We had a year to talk." "Ethan," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion, "you chose not to. The time for talking is over." One of the guards, a large, impassive man, gently but firmly placed a hand on Ethan's arm. "Sir, you need to come with me." The spell was broken. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. This wasn't a bad dream. It was real. Vanessa, realizing that tears and hysterics were having no effect, let out a final furious shriek. "You will not get away with this, you old witch!" The insult, so petty and childish, barely registered. I simply watched as they were escorted through the crowd, which parted for them like the Red Sea. No one said a word. No one offered a hand of comfort. They walked the gauntlet of their own making, stripped of their finery and their dignity, and were ushered out the grand front doors of the home they thought was theirs. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, the sound as final as a tomb sealing. The party was over. The guests, unsure what to do, began to leave in a quiet, awkward exodus. They avoided my eyes, murmuring apologies to no one in particular as they collected their things and scurried out into the night, eager to escape the scene of the carnage. Soon, only Mr. Albright and I were left, standing in the middle of the vast, trashed room. Half-empty glasses littered every surface. Discarded napkins and plates of half-eaten food told the story of a celebration cut short. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and vanished. The silence they left behind was immense. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the ringing silence of an explosion's aftermath. I walked over to the fireplace, the same spot where I had seen them dismiss Mrs. Gable. I ran my hand over the cool marble of the mantelpiece, over the spot where Richard's favorite seascape used to hang. It was just a blank wall now, a pale rectangle where the Pissarro had been. There was no sense of triumph. There was no joy. The satisfaction I had craved felt hollow, a phantom limb. I had won. I had executed my plan perfectly. I had reclaimed my life, my home, my fortune. But as I stood there, surveying the wreckage of my family, all I felt was a profound, aching emptiness. I had cut out the cancer, but the surgery had left a gaping wound. Mr. Albright came to stand beside me. "It's done, Margaret," he said softly. "Yes," I whispered, my eyes scanning the empty room. "It is." I thought of Ethan as a little boy, his hand in mine, walking on the beach just beyond those windows. I thought of the pride in his face when he learned to ride a bike on the long driveway outside. All those memories were still here, embedded in the walls of this house. But they were now tainted, overlaid with the ugliness of what had just transpired. I had proven my point. I had taught them a lesson they would never forget. But in the process, I had to accept the terrible truth. My son was gone. He had been gone for a long time. I hadn't lost him tonight. I had simply held the funeral. And as the dawn began to break, casting a pale, gray light into the room, I knew that this house could no longer be a home for me. It was a museum of a life that no longer existed. It was time to build a new one. The days that followed were a blur of legal formalities and quiet contemplation. Mr. Albright's team worked with ruthless efficiency, unwinding the web of deceit Ethan and Vanessa had woven. They recovered what they could of the sold items, though many, like the Pissarro, were lost to private collectors forever. The money they had siphoned was clawed back. Every asset was accounted for. Ethan and Vanessa vanished, swallowed by the shame of their public downfall. I heard through the grapevine that they had left the state, their names now synonymous with scandal among the social circles they had fought so hard to conquer. I felt nothing at the news, not pity, not satisfaction, just a quiet finality. I spent one last week in the villa, walking its silent halls. But the joy was gone. The rooms echoed with ghosts, not just of Richard, but of the family I thought I had. The laughter of the party, the ugly confrontation, the final pleading look in Ethan's eyes, it all lingered in the air like a foul odor. This house was a monument to a past I needed to release. My new purpose came to me, much like the original plan, during a moment of quiet reflection. I was sitting in the garden, watching the sun set over the Pacific, when a group of children from the town below walked past, their laughter bright and carefree. They were from the less affluent part of the community, the part I now knew so well. They had so little, yet their joy seemed so much more authentic than any I had witnessed at my son's party. That was it. That was the answer. I called Mr. Albright the next morning. "James," I said, a new energy in my voice, "I want to start a foundation, the Richard and Margaret Lewis Foundation for Underprivileged Children." The plan unfolded quickly. I would not sell the villa. I would transform it. The Grand Salon, where my son had celebrated his greed, would become a library and a tutoring center. The spacious bedrooms would be converted into classrooms for art and music. I would even buy a new piano, a better one. The sprawling lawns would not be for cocktail parties, but for playgrounds. This house, once a symbol of private wealth, would become a beacon of community, a place of opportunity for children who had none. The work was invigorating. It scrubbed the house clean of its painful memories and filled it with a new, vibrant energy. The day the foundation officially opened its doors was one of the proudest of my life. I stood on the front steps, the same steps Ethan and Vanessa had been cast out from, and watched as busloads of children poured onto the property, their eyes wide with wonder. Their laughter was the most beautiful music I had ever heard, far sweeter than any Chopin prelude. I saw a little girl sit down at the new grand piano and tentatively plink out a tune, her face alight with concentration and joy. I watched a group of boys kick a soccer ball across the lawn where catered tents once stood. This was true wealth. This was a legacy Richard would have been proud of. I no longer lived in the villa. I moved into a modest but comfortable condominium overlooking the same ocean. It was all the space I needed. My life was no longer defined by possessions, but by purpose. The pain of my son's betrayal had not vanished entirely. It was a scar I would carry forever. But it was no longer a gaping wound. It was a reminder that true value is not measured in carats or stock prices, but in character. It's found in kindness, in generosity, and in the joy you can bring to others. I had lost a son, but I had gained 100 children, and in their bright, hopeful faces, I had finally, truly, found my way home. We build our lives around the people we love, investing our time, our hearts, and our resources into them. We believe this is the most secure investment we can ever make. But sometimes, that market crashes. The foundation of what we thought was solid rock reveals itself to be nothing but sand. My story is one of a dramatic loss, but it led to an unexpected gain, the freedom of truth and a new purpose. It taught me that sometimes you have to burn down the life you knew to build the one you were meant to have. What does true wealth mean to you? Is it found in a bank account or in the people you surround yourself with? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to uphold your own values? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories give me strength, and they remind all of us that we are not alone in our struggles. Thank you for listening. Please, if this story touched you, Consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It means the world to me.